The early morning sun spilled its golden hue across Gate C-27 at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. Passengers shuffled through the terminal, clutching coffees and boarding passes, unaware that among them stood a man whose name was etched into history books. Colonel Frank Daniels, U.S. Army, retired, wore a navy blue blazer, khaki trousers, and a simple cap with the words Medal of Honor Recipient stitched above the bill. At 78, he still stood tall, shoulders back, posture rigid, though the slight limp in his left leg betrayed the decades-old injury from a mountainside firefight in Afghanistan. He was calm, even cheerful, holding a boarding pass stamped First Class, Seat 2A. He had received the ticket from the Department of Defense, a gesture of gratitude as he flew to speak at a military academy graduation in Denver. "Good morning." He nodded to the gate agent, a young woman named Kelly, no older than 24. She barely looked up from her screen. "Name?" she asked flatly. "Daniels, Colonel Frank Daniels." Her fingers tapped the keyboard. She glanced at the screen and frowned slightly. "Huh, looks like there's been a change. You've been moved to seat 23C in economy." Frank blinked. "That can't be right. My ticket's marked first class." Kelly shrugged without making eye contact. "There was a priority reassignment. Sorry, you'll still get there on time." "I understand," Frank said slowly, keeping his voice steady. "But I was booked in first for medical reasons. I have a leg injury and—" "There's nothing I can do," she interrupted. "First class is reserved for paying passengers and elite members. If there was an issue, you'll have to take it up with customer service after the flight." Behind him, another passenger, a man in a designer suit with a platinum elite tag on his bag, smirked. "Some folks just like to play dress up," he muttered under his breath. Frank didn't flinch. He simply nodded, folded his boarding pass, and turned toward the jet bridge. A few passengers looked at him, confused. One elderly woman whispered to her daughter, "Isn't that a Medal of Honor pin?" Frank took his seat in 23C, wedged between a teenager in earbuds and a father juggling a baby. The legroom was cramped. His injured knee began to throb almost immediately, but he said nothing. Back at the gate, a junior flight attendant named Maria had witnessed the exchange. She stared after Colonel Daniels, her gut twisting. She'd been raised in a military family. Her grandfather had served in Korea. Her brother was active duty Air Force. She recognized that medal the second she saw it, and she knew what it meant. Maria hesitated, then tapped a message into her crew tablet, flagging the issue to her supervisor. "Possible VIP disrespected at Gate C-27, she typed. "Medal of Honor recipient downgraded, passenger visibly limping. Recommend immediate review." Inside the plane, the crew went about their routines. The businessman who had mocked Frank earlier was now sipping champagne in Seat 2A. He had been the priority reassignment. Frank closed his eyes and breathed in deeply. He had endured worse. Sandstorms, sniper fire, political briefings. But something about this, the quiet humiliation of being treated like baggage rather than a man, it sat heavy on his chest. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. Just tired. From the cockpit, the final boarding procedures were underway. The captain's voice crackled on the intercom. "Cabin crew, prepare for departure!" But just before the doors closed, just before the aircraft could push back from the gate, there was a knock on the cabin door. It wasn't the gate agent. It wasn't a crew member. It was someone else entirely. The knock on the cabin door startled the crew. "Who's that?" murmured the co-pilot, glancing toward the entrance. The lead flight attendant hesitated before unlocking it. As the door swung open, the crew snapped to attention. A man in a gray tailored suit stepped onto the plane, tall, composed, and unmistakably in command. His ID badge bore the name James Whitmore, President and CEO, Northwest Skies Airlines. He didn't smile. "Which seat is 23C?" he asked calmly, his voice low but firm. The flight attendant stammered. "Aisle left side toward the back." Whitmore gave a polite nod and walked past first class without so much as a glance at the champagne-sipping businessman now reclining in the very seat meant for a national hero. As he moved down the aisle, murmurs rippled through the cabin. Passengers straightened in their seats. Phones were discreetly raised. Someone whispered, "That's the airline president?" Frank Daniels didn't look up. He was focused on breathing through the sharp ache in his leg. His hands rested quietly on his lap, worn knuckles betraying a life of calluses and command. The cries of the baby next to him had faded into white noise. When Whitmore finally reached row 23, he paused. "Colonel Daniels." Frank looked up slowly, startled. "Yes?" "My name is James Whitmore," the man said. "I'm the president of this airline. May I speak with you for a moment?" Frank nodded, more confused than anything else. "Of course." Whitmore knelt slightly to meet him at eye level. "I was informed a few minutes ago that you were downgraded from first class. I reviewed the incident myself. On behalf of Northwest Skies, I offer you a personal and unconditional apology. That should never have happened." Frank blinked, unsure of what to say. Whitmore continued, "Your seat has been reinstated, and I would be honored to personally escort you there." For a moment, no one spoke. Even the restless toddler nearby had gone still, watching the exchange with wide eyes. Frank hesitated. "I don't want to cause trouble, son. I serve so others wouldn't have to be inconvenienced." Whitmore shook his head. "Sir, you didn't cause the trouble. You represent the very best of this country. The mistake was ours, and I'm here to correct it." Reluctantly, Frank stood. As he did, every eye in the cabin turned toward him. A few passengers began to clap quietly. Others simply stared, unsure how to process what they were witnessing. The businessman in seat 2A looked up in disbelief as Whitmore approached. "Is there a problem?" he asked, already defensive. Whitmore's expression never changed. "Yes, you're in the wrong seat." "I'm Platinum Elite," the man snapped. "I was upgraded." Whitmore gestured toward Frank. "You were upgraded at the expense of a Medal of Honor recipient. That won't stand. You'll be flying in seat 23C today." The man scoffed. "You can't just—" "I can," Whitmore said calmly. "And I just did." There was no argument after that. As the entitled passenger was quietly ushered to the back, Whitmore guided Colonel Daniels to the front of the plane. He didn't just return him to first class. He offered him his own reserved seat, usually kept empty for last-minute dignitaries or emergencies. Frank sat down slowly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Whitmore leaned down once more. "If there's anything else you need, you let me know. This airline owes you more than just a seat." Frank managed a quiet smile. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Whitmore turned to the crew. "Please update the manifest and inform the cabin. I'll make a brief announcement." He walked toward the front, adjusted his tie, and picked up the intercom. Meanwhile, passengers across the cabin exchanged glances. The whispers were louder now. People were pulling out phones, texting family and friends. "You won't believe what just happened." The plane was still grounded, but something had changed in the air. The humiliation Colonel Daniels had endured moments ago had just been transformed into something far more powerful. And the next voice over the intercom would make sure everyone on board knew exactly why. James Whitmore stood just behind the cockpit door, hand steady on the intercom. For a moment, he paused, not out of hesitation, but to choose his words with care. In his years as president of Northwest Skies, he'd dealt with turbulence, emergencies, corporate shakeups, but none of them quite like this. He pressed the button. The chime echoed across the cabin. Conversations hushed instantly. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice rang through the speakers, calm and clear. "This is James Whitmore, president of Northwest Skies Airlines. I apologize for interrupting your morning, but I want to address something important before we take off." Back in 2A, Colonel Daniels shifted slightly, trying to make himself smaller in the large seat. He was never comfortable being put in the spotlight. The Medal of Honor, to him, wasn't a symbol of superiority. It was a reminder of the soldiers who hadn't come home. Whitmore continued, "Today, one of our passengers was mistakenly downgraded, a man who didn't complain, didn't demand anything, and walked quietly to his new seat, despite a painful injury. That man is Colonel Frank Daniels, a retired officer, a public servant, and a Medal of Honor recipient." A hush fell across the plane like a soft blanket. Gasps could be heard. Eyes turned toward Frank. Whitmore's voice didn't waver. "For those unfamiliar, the Medal of Honor is our nation's highest military decoration. It is awarded for valor far above and beyond the call of duty. Colonel Daniels earned his in 2007 during an ambush in Kunar Province, Afghanistan. Despite being wounded, he held off enemy forces and saved 4 members of his unit." The businessman now sitting in coach slouched lower in his seat. Passengers who had previously ignored Frank now leaned forward, hanging on every word. "We failed him today," Whitmore said plainly, "not because of a policy, but because someone forgot what respect looks like. That's on us, and we're correcting it." Frank stared out the window, his eyes misty now. He could feel the attention bearing down on him, but not in the way it once did. This wasn't a parade or ceremony. It was something quieter, more personal. This was dignity being restored in real time. "Let this serve as a reminder," Whitmore said, "that while elite status may earn you a free drink or early boarding, honor earns you something far greater: our gratitude, our respect, and our seat." Applause erupted. It wasn't polite or forced. It was real, the kind that starts slow and builds into a wave. Even the toddler 2 rows back clapped his tiny hands, mimicking the grown-ups around him. Whitmore set the intercom back in its cradle. He turned, made eye contact with Frank, and offered a firm nod before quietly stepping off the plane and returning to the jet bridge. His job was done. The flight attendants resumed their duties, but everything felt different now. One of them, Maria, the same junior crew member who had reported the situation, approached Frank with the tissue in a whispered, "Sir, thank you for everything." Frank smiled. "Thank you for noticing." From the cockpit, the captain's voice replaced Whitmore's. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now cleared for departure. Flight time to Denver is approximately 2 hours and 21 minutes. Sit back, relax, and if you're in first class today, you're sitting among greatness." In row 23C, the man who had laughed earlier now stared blankly ahead, avoiding the gaze of everyone around him. As the plane taxied onto the runway, Frank leaned back in his seat, adjusting his leg gently. The pain was still there, would always be there, but for once it was softened by something unexpected, the quiet satisfaction that, this time, someone had stood up for him. And not just anyone, the very man at the top. The aircraft lifted gently off the tarmac, ascending into the morning sky. But for once, the true altitude of the flight wasn't measured in feet. It was measured in something far less tangible and far more powerful: respect. First class was unusually quiet, not the stiff business suit kind of silence, but the kind that follows awe, like the hush in a cathedral. Colonel Frank Daniels sat with his hands folded, staring at the soft clouds outside the window, his thoughts drifting far beyond the altitude readouts. He wasn't used to moments like this. The missions, the loss, the cold nights in makeshift camps, those he could handle. But gratitude, public thanks, that always made him uncomfortable. Yet today, it didn't feel like a publicity stunt. It felt real. The flight attendant, Maria, returned with a tray. "Colonel Daniels," she said warmly, "we wanted to offer you something special." On the tray sat a sealed letter and a small black case. Frank raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" She smiled. "The letter is from our corporate office. Mr. Whitmore had it drafted in real time while he was still here. The case, well, open it and see." Frank opened the case carefully. Inside was a gleaming lifetime pass, engraved with his name, military branch, and the airline's crest. "Unlimited flights, first class, for any destination we serve," she said. "It's not charity, it's acknowledgement." Frank stared at the card, struck silent. Maria continued gently, "There's a note inside, too." Frank picked up the envelope and opened it with trembling hands. The letter read, "Colonel Daniels, this is more than a ticket. It's a small thank you for what you've given our country. You never asked for honor, but you've earned it 1,000 times over. Travel freely. Always first. Always respected. James Whitmore, President, Northwest Skies." Airlines. Frank set the letter down carefully. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Maria stood nearby, unsure whether to say anything else. Then Frank chuckled softly. "They don't usually make the battlefield emotional, but this might be the first mission where I lose my composure." Maria smiled. "It's okay to feel seen, sir." Suddenly, another first-class passenger, a teenage boy traveling with his mother, stood up and approached shyly. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said, holding a sketch pad. I saw your medal earlier. I'm in 8th grade. We learned about it in history class. Would it be okay if I drew you?" Frank blinked in surprise. "You want to draw me?" The boy nodded. "I want to show my teacher someone real, someone who didn't just exist in a textbook." Frank looked at the mother, who gave an encouraging nod. He smiled, touched. "All right, son, but just make sure I've still got some hair in the drawing." Laughter bubbled through the cabin. Other passengers began smiling, exchanging looks. The tension that had once hung over row 23C had fully lifted. Something more profound had settled in its place. Later, as the boy sketched quietly a few seats down, another ripple of change passed through the aircraft. One by one, passengers began walking up to Frank. Some extended hands. Others offered quiet nods or whispered, "Thank you." A young couple offered to buy him a drink. A woman handed him a handwritten note on a napkin. A man in business attire simply placed his hand over his heart and mouthed, "Respect." Even the pilot came out of the cockpit once the aircraft reached cruising altitude. "Colonel Daniels," he said with a firm handshake, "from one veteran to another, it's an honor to have you aboard." By the time the captain returned to his seat, Frank's tray table was full, not with food but with tokens of appreciation. Thank you notes, a small hand-drawn flag from a child, and even a pin from a fellow veteran seated in coach who'd quietly asked a flight attendant to deliver it. It was overwhelming, but in the best way. As the clouds stretched endlessly outside the window, Frank sat back in his seat. He wasn't just moving through the air, he was moving through something rarer, a moment in time when the world had remembered what honor meant. No one knew it yet, but one of the flight attendants had discreetly recorded Whitmore's cabin announcement. Within hours, it would go viral. By the time the wheels touched down in Denver, millions would already be watching, and the man who had quietly accepted humiliation at the gate was now becoming the face of quiet heroism across the country. As the plane began its descent into Denver, a calm announcement from the captain stirred the passengers from their thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach. Please return your seats to the upright position and prepare for landing." Colonel Frank Daniels looked out the window as the Rocky Mountains rose into view, snow still capping their jagged peaks even in spring. The clouds thinned, revealing the sprawling city below, but Frank's focus wasn't on the scenery anymore. It was on the whirlwind of the last 2 hours. What started as a quiet, painful moment of humiliation had turned into something he never expected: healing. For years, he had walked through airports unnoticed, favoring the back row, never asking for recognition, not because he resented his service, but because it had cost him so much. His leg, his peace, his friends. The medal sat in a box most days, tucked away like a photo too heavy to display. But today, for the first time in a long time, he felt truly seen. As the aircraft touched down with a soft thud and rolled toward the gate, a ripple of movement spread through the cabin. Passengers stood, grabbing their bags, but their eyes kept glancing toward 2A, toward him. Maria, the flight attendant, approached again. "Colonel Daniels," she said, "you're cleared to deplane first. Mr. Whitmore made sure of that. A cart will meet you at the jet bridge to assist with your transfer." Frank shook his head lightly. "I think I'll walk this one." She smiled. "Then let me walk with you." As he stepped off the plane, a hush fell again in the jet bridge. 2 airline staff members stood at attention, one holding a small bouquet, the other a folded flag in a display case, gifts hastily arranged by the corporate team once they realized the magnitude of the moment. Frank paused, surprised. "I don't need all this," he murmured. One of the staffers, a young woman barely in her 20s, replied, "Sir, maybe not, but we needed it." That hit him harder than he expected. Outside the gate, passengers who had already exited the flight lingered, some holding their phones, others simply watching. And in the background, clicks, flashes. A few reporters had arrived, tipped off by social media. Word was already spreading. Frank stopped briefly to thank the staff and then turned to Maria. "You were the first to speak up. Don't let that part of you ever get quiet." She nodded, eyes glassy. "I won't." Later that night, Frank checked into his quiet Denver hotel. When he turned on the TV, his own face greeted him. News anchors told the story across multiple networks. Headlines read, "Airline President Honors Medal of Honor, Hero After Gate Disrespect." From disregarded to respected, veteran seat restored in viral airline moment. And the video, already passed 5 million views in under 12 hours. He smiled, just slightly, not for fame, not for validation, but because maybe, just maybe, this would make someone in uniform tomorrow feel a little less invisible. And that was enough. If this story moved you, show your support. Like the video, subscribe to our channel, and help us share more powerful, real-life stories of honor, courage, and redemption.